That's y'all. That's Tennessean for hello. And since thanks very much for your invitation to present, and since we are in Canada, land of two languages, let me also say bonjour et je vous remercie de votre invitation à présenter mon point de vue sur la dissuasion dans la nouvelle ère. Hopefully, I got that somewhat right. It's been a while since I was at West Point teaching there, but I did stay in a Holiday Inn last night, so I'm good there. As Todd said, I am Ed Dorman. I'm the Director for Logistics and Engineering, J4 at U.S. Central Command. And I hope to convince you over the next 30 minutes or so why you can't spell deterrence without an L. So bear with me as I make my case. Now, I'm sure some of you are probably wondering why a CENTCOM representative. As you know, U.S. CENTCOM has been and remains the only combatant command executing active combat operations, and it's something we do not foresee changing in the near future. In doing so, we have consumed a great deal of readiness and resources, which creates some fatigue. You're also probably apt to scratch your heads and say, what could you possibly tell a conference of esteemed experts and academics about deterrence, since whatever it is you're doing in CENTCOM ain't working? Well, if nothing else, I can at least report to my boss, General Joe Votel, that there are still some locations within defense circles which have not yet succumbed entirely to what is known in medical terms as CENTCOM fatigue. And we are the main effort. I just want to reinforce that. Okay. I know they're planning for some things elsewhere, but it's all about us. Okay. I'd especially like to thank Todd, recently promotable. It just came out on the colonel's list last week, and Professor Van Latke for helping me receive an invitation to be a part of such a great venue. Now, it's no secret that Canada and U.S. are two great allies separated by a common language, and y'all spell defense with a C. And so I'm going to frame my remarks on how I spell deterrence with an L. And that's a big L for logistics at the national level. You see, I believe that second to the nuclear deterrent, and perhaps eclipsing it in the new era, that innovative, synchronized, and resilient logistics across multiple domains is what truly forms the foundation of successful deterrence. Because it's really the actor who identifies and refines the problem, rapidly iterates and innovates, and then brings a coalition of partners together against the entirety of the problem who will gain the strategic upper hand. 21st century policy and strategy formulation, in my mind, requires both 21st century problem-solving methods as well as a forward-thinking, innovative mindset. So credible deterrence, as we see it in the CENTCOM AOR, relies on signaling the capability to resolve to deny or punish an adversary. Well, that's something we all know. And it's really more about risk calculation and preserving decision space and creating options for senior leaders who are most often weighing their considerations from a point of national will, either across their own nation or across that of allies and partners in the greater coalition. And nothing creates options and decision space more than robust logistics, which I say underpinned by vibrant, thriving economies linked through engaged diplomacy and information sharing agreements, enable partners and allies to really exercise the collective industrial capacity, agreements, and organic and non-organic expeditionary, what I would call mobility and joint reception staging onward movement capabilities to rapidly project and aggregate military forces at a time and place of our choosing and sustain it indefinitely. Now, I was reading an article recently by Sir Lawrence Friedman, and he termed this as deterrence as a strategic effect, I think, because he was comparing strategy and effects, right? And I think that being able to contribute to effects occurring routinely, you're not really sure whether they're working or not, but you got to do those day-to-day things to make sure deterrence is credible, I believe. Okay, Dorman, but how does that relate to CENTCOM, and more importantly, how does that relate to logistics, or the big L? Well, if you think about the many factors driving change and uncertainty across the globe, U.S. allied and partner commitment in the CENTCOM region remains as important as ever. Now, there's a tendency to want to withdraw everything from CENTCOM before it's time, and I think that would be bad because we contribute in a lot of ways to deterrence globally. But I would just say we've got to stay there in some ways. And so as we adapt to the new National Defense Strategy and implementation guidance, We recognize that the revised prioritization of global threats and the changes in application of force that have been directed. But in my mind, recent experience has shown that of the 2+3, of which our NDS is most concerned, that's Russia and China, plus the DPRK, Iran, and our violent extremist organizations. The fact is, all 5 of those threats are operating without impunity, essentially, within the CENTCOM AOR, either covertly or overtly. And therefore, I see CENTCOM's contributions to strategic deterrence from both a regional and global perspective. And keep in mind, at least in my opinion, deterrence is in the eye of the beholder. For it to work, all elements of national power have to be applied and understood by adversaries and potential adversaries alike against them in that way. And because I'm from Tennessee, if you couldn't already tell through that French that I threw out there, I'm sometimes accused of simplifying the complex into something that's easier to understand. And to that I say, guilty as charged. So here's Dorman's formula for deterrence. Capability to the power of logistics times resolve times signaling equals deterrence. You got that? Okay, I'll do it again. Capability to the power of logistics times resolve times signaling equals deterrence. Because logistics exponentially magnifies capability. And capabilities that don't present sufficient dilemmas across all domains to adequately affect adversaries' risk calculus, or capabilities that cannot reach the fight or be sustained, are no real threat, and therefore no deterrence, regardless of signaling or resolve. Now, our combatant commands, all of them, are a critical component to the nation's deterrence, both regionally and globally. And due to the trans-regional nature of today's threats, we recognize that we have to work beyond the regional boundaries. Those are coming down. And in general, in the CENTCOM, General Votel's strategic approach is one of prepare, pursue, prevail, underpinned by a solid foundation of Big L logistics, synchronized from the national strategic to tactical levels and nested inside the NDS. First, we prepare the environment by ensuring the right forces, footprints, and agreements are in place, ensuring conditions are set for stabilization post-contingency operations, and to enable deterrence more broadly. A prepared environment, along with exercises and operations, are a powerful signal to friend and foe alike that contribute to deterrence. I see this as essential, and it contributes not only to deterring state-on-state aggression, it also contributes to deterring the exportation of threat vectors to our collective homelands, which helps preserve regional balances of power and substantially helps us achieve our strategic objectives in the interest of our national strategies. Secondly, we pursue opportunities to strengthen alliances which provide the necessary agreements that enable access, basing, and overflight. And we also work very diligently in the J4 on the theater security cooperation with the J5 to build sufficient partner capacity. This enables our ability to work by, with, and through, one of our core tenets in the CENTCOM AOR. And while we've been successful in this coalition-centric approach, it's not always been easy or efficient due to a lack of adequate authorities. And so I would offer, moving forward, in the light of some of the new era challenges that present themselves, there's really a required paradigm shift and deliberate acceptance of risk that we need to take on in order to foster an environment of reciprocal information sharing. Strong partnerships exponentially increase our potential for deterrence. Having prepared the environment and pursued opportunities, we can prevail by either denying our adversaries opportunities or punishing them when they choose to seek to move beyond competition into confrontation. It's the threat of our ability to prevail over an enemy that is the heart of deterrence. And so if they cross red lines which we have signaled, first we have to signal them, in order to test us, even short of war in this gray space that we talk about, we've got to make them think about that risk and that they'll lose, something that's near and dear to them. And so we at CENTCOM remain mindful, though, that ours is a team effort and that a successful deterrence in line with ongoing contingency operations requires both a regional and trans-regional approach. So we've got to work with the fellow combatant commands, our component commands, our regional task forces, the 18 countries across the CENTCOM AOR, the fourth estate, which I'll call industry, which is critically important, and the agencies and organizations that form that global joint intergovernmental, interagency, and multinational enterprise. coupled with elements of national power appropriately applied. And I think it will help us. So in recent years, I talk about the fascinating contemplation of the power of new weapons. Precision-guided munitions come to mind, and new platforms. And many think about, what does logistics have to do with deterrence? It's not even going to be an issue. We've got plenty, right? We'll just go get more because it's magic. It doesn't really work like that, but when you consider precision-guided munitions, for example, and what they mean to our force and how we consume them and the current consumption rates, as well as who consumes them, not just the U.S., but our partner nations as well, and we have to have sufficiency. Or you think about the force caps that we have in our contingency operations, which limit our abilities to have the requisite logistics capability organically. We have to find the balance between organic and non-organic. It can affect our ability to echelon the logistics we need and be more responsive, and therefore detracts from deterrence. Now, I'm often accused of being a frustrated operator. That's because I rarely miss an opportunity to inject my opinions on Big L's role in gray space competition, or where a lack of Big L will significantly impact our ability to create that decision space I talked about earlier. However, when you think about the new era challenges that you talk about, I think about things like space, cyberspace, the information arena, and those also have a profound impact on our ability to develop, produce, deploy, distribute, store, and execute the complex acquisitions, logistics, and distribution which underpin our ability to be where we need to be when we need to be there, even if people think we can't be there, right? So that causes that thinking about the risk calculus. And again, ordinarily, I'm in the room, nobody asks anything. Hey, do you have an opinion? So there's not much thought given to the impacts on logistics. It's just going to happen across space, cyberspace, and information domains. But if you think about things like ships navigations, autonomous vehicles, in-transit visibility, our ability to sequence our transactions and things like imports and activities like that. National and coalition level logistics enterprise systems are heavily reliant on a healthy, what I call space and cyberspace ecosystem. And then you think about our global logistics information technology systems right on the unclassified net with substantial vulnerabilities. It makes them a target as well. Recently, General McDough sat before the House Armed Services Committee, and he talked about these vulnerabilities during his annual statement. And he said, they're really trying to undertake at TRANSCOM, how do we get after affecting the global distribution and deployment supply chain and network and mobility systems that we have to work with industry and that are vulnerable, and how are we getting after the cyber aspects of that. Additionally, I would say that when you look at logistics, the loss of access to rare earth minerals and the potential for counterfeit or corrupted chips that we have seen that get into the acquisition space impact logistics support from national to tactical level across all the domains, especially when you think about precision-guided munitions and others. So we have to overcome the potential denial of this critical resource and build our own capability to deny or threaten adversaries in this realm. So with technological advantages, proposed projects like asteroid mining could give us back the edge. Just saying, throwing it out there. Finally, I believe we as logisticians are losing the narrative on the implications of our business relative to the impact we can have on deterrence. We're not communicating well, and we have to communicate and participate in the signaling of both our contributions and total and holistic requirements to industry to help ensure adequate resourcing. So it's industry, this is what the capacity, and these are the requirements. Congress, this is really why we need all of what we need, and this is how it contributes in that formula I gave you earlier. Also, our inability to reform the acquisition process to operate at the speed of need and provide holistic requirements, as I just talked about, which enable that right resourcing, continues to be a problem as we wrestle with what I would say is an antiquated defense federal acquisition regulation. Lastly, we have to leverage innovation in a smart way and ensure we understand the delineation between invention and true innovation. We seem to be focused on inventions like 3D printing and We use the buzzword artificial intelligence and machine learning a lot, but we don't seem to move past that into how we're going to employ it, what we're going to do with it, and how it's going to help us writ large. Also, social media, the acquisition information space, as I call it, have been impacted by our adversaries' ability to hinder our outcomes, spread false information or misleading information about activities or about locations and activities. And so that's hindering us, and it's something we got to work on as well, and have a devastating effect on our ability to maintain the right support. A secret critical vulnerability could negate a capability central to deterrence if that's leaked or stolen by adversaries. And so we're trying to get after that and hinder our abilities to, one thing I noticed recently was the use of contracting capability that we were heavily reliant on. We had an adversary that went in and simply contracted out all that capability that we were reliant upon in order to rapidly aggregate the force and move it where it needed to be. They didn't really need it, but they tied it up and they prevented us from having it, using our own systems against us. And so we couldn't really exercise in the way we wanted to, and it kind of caught us off guard. That brings us back to why you need an L to spell deterrence. I think our biggest challenges today in effective deterrence result from unconstrained operations and lack of prioritization. Failure to reduce the vulnerabilities of our logistics infrastructure as well and capabilities in this unconstrained environment, slow operational tempo, impede our effectiveness. But rather than a vulnerability, we can, through informed planning and execution and artfully applied logistics, create the force we need from the force we have. And a robust, resilient, exercised, and tightly synchronized, what I call networked ecosystem of multiple modes, nodes, sources, and routes, which span from the national to tactical level, improves resiliency, responsiveness, and substantially enables credible deterrence. Now, going back to my simplified equation of capability to the power of logistics times resolves times signaling, you can begin to understand the role and relationship of a legitimate, robust, and well-exercised logistics capability to rapid power projection. And I'm naturally talking about our strategic deployment and distribution system, which allows us to project combat power anywhere in the world at a time and place of our choosing and sustain it indefinitely. That's truly what makes the U.S. the world's only superpower, but with our coalition and partners and allies allows us to really place the hammer where it needs to be, if it needs to be placed there, or to just simply put people into a house of mirrors so that we confound their ability to respond in the way they want to, because we can be where we need to be in a way we need to be there in order to confound them. So when you think about that, over the past decade and a half, probably more, a lot of our infrastructure has begun to atrophy, and so we've got to begin investing in that. Ports, both CONUS and OCONUS, need some significant upgrade. We also need to clearly educate people that ports are not holistic entities, right? There are a lot of different activities that operate inside of those ports, much of which we don't know or have any control over, that are third-level suppliers and things of that nature. But by making some smart investments, I think we can strengthen interoperability, restore our investment in infrastructure, and look at this from a people, posture, and processes perspective. First, we also have to do our part at CENTCOM in preparing the environment that I talked about earlier. And if you listen to the chairman, it's about globally integrated operations. So we have to set the globe, because you can't have globally integrated operations unless you got globally integrated logistics. And I would tell you that based on my time in CENTCOM, but more importantly coming out of the Pacific, where we worked this extensively, to set the theater, a theater's never really set. It's true, it's continuously evolving, and we're continuously working to optimize our posture and its accompanying network of modes, nodes, sources, and routes to ensure it remains active and resilient. And that enhances our ability to do the trans-regional aspects of dynamic force employment and rapid force aggregation. If we understand and maximize the scarce strategic resources that we have, transportation resources and assets, both organic and non-organic, while strengthening relationships with industry allies and strategic partners, I think we'll be in a better spot. So a balanced portfolio, in my mind, will require having the proper authorities as well, so that we can position and reposition deployment and distribution and reception capability assets, which will enhance agility, mitigate risk, and increase not only General Votel's decision space, but that of POTUS and other senior leaders, so that we enhance options and increase their decision space. The aging infrastructure and its reliance on networks with significant vulnerabilities that have recently been exploited, such as with the non-PETYA, if you're familiar with that, by our adversaries, have to be hardened against those threats in order to continue to create that deterrent capability. One example of an OCONUS improvement that we've made in the CENTCOM AOR is the development of something called the Trans-Arabian Network. It's an elaborate system of connecting interior and exterior lines of communication. It enables dynamic expeditionary force reception, staging, and onward movement across all modes, nodes, routes, and across all domains. So it's increasing capability, it's demonstrating resolve, and it recently sent the Iranians a fairly strong signal about what we can do, when we can do it, and doing things that they thought, I'm not sure why they're operating there or how they're operating there, because nobody's done that before. And that's good, because it feeds back into the formula. But more work is to be done. We have to implement new and innovative ways of sharing information with commercial industry, allies, and other partners to expand resiliency and competitive space. And more importantly, we have to refine and reduce what I would call lengthy intergovernmental processes. These are customs, diplomatic, border crossing, and other acquisition space activities that the military alone can't affect. It takes that joint, combined intergovernmental aspect, and we're working that with the Kingdom and across the GCC to try and get towards a common border crossing process, and as an example. And so in the future, I think we're going to have successful deterrence, we're going to have to revolutionize information integration and have expanded authorities. I think equally we have to enhance our unity of effort horizontally across business processes so that we can combine actions across all domains and all dimensions of national power to identify where we have weaknesses and vulnerabilities, especially in terms of economic, technological, and informational within the sustainment enterprise. And we're going to have to do something about our continued reliance on unclassified information domain, because it creates vulnerabilities across those modes, nodes, routes, and sources that I talked about. But making those smart investments can ensure strategic predictability and operational unpredictability. I think that's what we have to get towards. And that's really our strength, is integrated action with allies, which signal a commitment to deterring aggression through dynamic force employment, a sound military posture, exercises and operations which introduce unpredictability to adversaries' decision makers. And then with allies and partners, we can challenge those competitors and maneuver them into unfavorable positions in war or short of war, frustrating their efforts and precluding their options. Now, current operations and ongoing sustainment requirements engage a significant portion of the total force, and that limits our capacity to surge or meet increased deployment and distribution demands. In the DoD, we historically leveraged our reserve component as a strategic reserve. However, we've been doing that for about the past 30 years in both the Guard and the Reserve, and that's worn them down quite substantially. There's some conditions that exacerbate this, to include physical uncertainty, predictability of budgets, aging fleets of aircraft and surface vessels, especially in shipping. Soon we'll be the only owners of steam-powered vessels. That's not a good thing, I don't think. And an over-reliance, what I call an over-reliance on contracted logistics capability that's often fixed in place and unable to echelon. It doesn't give you operational flexibility or reach. So we got to find that sweet spot. But despite these many challenges of our time, I'd say that global integration, emerging technologies, and the collective experience of our logistics, sustainment, our engineering forces present opportunities to strengthen logistics as a big L and improve effectiveness of operations while decreasing risk to force. So some key areas. So we have to prepare the environment. I talked about that. Pursue opportunities to overcome challenges, and I think this takes on 4 areas: lethality, agility, modernization of systems, and acquisition reform. When you think about lethality, I would opine This is the frustrated operator. There's not a single lethal capability without a logistics requirement. They just don't exist. We have to stay ahead of the requirements and implications of tech breakthroughs in commercial and organic industry and leverage those more efficiently. We also have to understand what the holistic requirements are so we can give those to industry so we can have the requisite capacity, not just inside the United States, but in partner and ally nations to have the right industry footprint there. That impacts our ability to create capabilities for platforms, capacity to surge, reinforces trust, and a lot of other things. And then maintaining lethality requires assessment of supplier capability inside the supply chain, as well as, in my opinion, some investments in new logistics and joint reception staging, onward movement enabling systems. Paying attention to things like Army watercraft, dynamic basing capabilities, and operational energy capabilities that allow us, once we've projected power, to take advantage of it. Now, agility. When you think about deterrence capabilities, you got to have agile logistics. And the core of our ability to threaten or deny is based on dynamic force employment and rapid movement and aggregation of combat power. So we have to work with national leadership in the diplomatic, economic, and informational spheres to expand our reach and flexibility in lines of communication. And we also have to work on what I would call enhanced basing, much like a project we have at MSAB in Jordan, where we have not just a fighter base, but we have a composite base that also includes joint partners, the Army and the Air Force, as well as some other partners that we have, some international partners who are operating out of there. If we get that footprint right, that posture right, and that connection, it gives us greater ability to flex and do what we need to do. And we also have to integrate industry and academia into our footprint and our thought space. I think that's critical if we're going to create and maintain an innovative edge in threat creation and denial capability. In terms of modernization, I simply say you can't expect success with today with yesterday's capabilities, most of which have been mortgaged or cannot deploy in time, or we're limiting because we have force cap constraints. And we're often quick to send trigger pullers downrange, but we don't have logisticians that can echelon to the location to repair in time, as an example. And when you think about mobility systems, we have an aging organic sea lift fleet I talked about, as well as a reduction in U.S. flag vessels, threatening our ability to meet national security requirements. And if we continue to lose those ships, I think deployments like we have seen in the past will be at risk. We'll be reliant on foreign flag carriers. And then we have laws against that, the Jones Act and others, which preclude us from doing that. Perhaps more importantly, our manpower, our crews are aging out, which when you try to look at the pool of qualified licensed merchant mariners who crew America's ships, that places that at risk there. And then we have to think about baking in cyber protection into our networks and processes. Although most of the planning takes place on classified networks, 90% of the military logistics and global movement operations are executed out there in the unclassified commercial networks. The fact that we can't get DoD's industry partners in line with the NIST standards also continues to create vulnerabilities which provide access to that information for our adversaries. So I think it goes beyond the authority of a single combatant command to defend the DoD information in commercial networks. And so cyber is really a truly trans-regional threat to our deterrence capability. Mission assurance, particularly in degraded and contested environments, requires a collective effort. We're moving towards hardening our overall cybersecurity posture, but more work needs to be done. We're also partnering with industry at CENTCOM with a program called LogWorks. This was really a spin-off of Hondo Gertz and his SoftWorks, but that was more focused on soft operators and material solutions. We're looking at best practices for information sharing and joint logistics processes to help us get to data analytics quicker, have greater shared awareness, and leverage industry really at the speed of need to address technology challenges outside of traditional pipelines. And that creates some cultural challenges as we look to incorporate the latest technology from industry into our program, as evidenced by the recent spat between Google and the DoD over facial recognition software for drones, if you read about that. And acquisition. My final point, we have to reform the way we approach acquisition. Now, I hear a lot about acquisition reform. We're going to start an Army Futures Command, and the program managers are going to work there. But if we're going to stay ahead of the curve and present multiple dilemmas for adversaries, we have to get after this. We've got a backlog of deferred readiness, procurement, and modernization of logistics requirements, and it's coupled with an imbalance in contracted capability, and that's continuing to grow, and we can't ignore it anymore. And we have to make targeted, disciplined increases in personnel and platforms to meet key capability and capacity needs, including the right mix of organic and industry mobility assets, port operating, global shared awareness, and theater movement control systems. So the bottom line is, just like in Canada where you can't spell defense without a C, from the CENTCOM perspective, you can't spell deterrence without the big L of logistics. It exponentially magnifies the capability. Every capability at the heart of our deterrent strategies cannot be employed or sustained without logistics. The crucial keystone requires us to look at logistics from an institutional perspective, in my opinion, considering how we're going to develop our people, relationships, and processes to ensure capability is not limited by our failure to develop the institutions, ours and partners, necessary for credible signaling of our resolve. Recruit and retain the best and brightest to help us maintain that advantage. And while the mind naturally goes to the military members and our civilian workforce, we have to expand that definition to include our industry, academia, and coalition partners. We really have to walk the walk. We talk about bringing the coalition in. We got to get better. We have to understand that our partnerships and capability is dependent upon a network of people and relationships which forms a pool for our collective strength. These relationships, in my mind, shape processes and open new avenues through cooperation for which we can create new threats and capabilities to contribute to a strong and credible potential for reprisal that discourages that first aggressive action. As we modernize and streamline our processes and those of our partners, we exponentially increase our capability. So as I noted in my formula, logistics is a necessary part of the equation, without which every other element is weakened. So I hope in this short time I've convinced you of my initial claim that you cannot spell deterrence without an L. May God bless each of you. May God bless Canada and the United States. And may He keep our alliance on a path of strength for years to come.